The good old days. A devil's advocacy. Having been a rebellious youth, I can attest that the good old days were not so good. First off, conformity, right or wrong, was king. Sure, we can talk about the parameters of conformity in today's world and somehow equalize them with those of the past. It's easy to argue that one conforms just as much today, but to different standards. But I believe that there is more room for individual out-of-the-closet nonconformity than ever before, if the opportunity is taken. Things we now take for granted were once so tabooed as to be unthinkable. In the good old days, if you didn't believe in God, you at least paid lip service to a benign supreme being. Oddly enough, the devil did not constitute a threat and was able to be utilized in all manner of popular culture. He could appear in anything from food products to sports team mascots without consternation. As long as one believed in God, it was perfectly alright to entertain Satan for fun. If you were actually serious about metaphysical pursuits, you ran the risk of being pointed out as a strange cultist at best or a devil worshiper at worst. The Rosicrucians were about as dark as you could get. Institutions such as the military had no provision for alternative offbeat religions. If you weren't of a Christian denomination, you must be Jewish, a separate kind of human being tolerated at best. At least Jews could change their names to live like Christians and nobody'd be the wiser. Not so with people of color. They were stuck with their stigma. It is inconceivable today what real racism was like in the good old days. Romantics like to talk of the slower pacing of yesterday. In many ways, it wasn't so good. If you were traveling abroad and got homesick, you couldn't jump on a jet and be back in your own bed in a few hours. Mail was slow, and long-distance telephone was a costly luxury. Well-made products were so well-made that it took 4 strong men to move an item that could now be single-handedly lifted into a van. Respectable folk didn't drive such vehicles for personal use. Back-breaking labor accompanied tasks that are now effortless. Driving a car was a greater risk. Tires blew out. Presumably efficient fails brakes. A slight nudge from the car in the next parking space was good for a cracked grille, dented fender, or locked bumpers. Radiators overheated, and most vehicles, if subjected to today's driving conditions, would be stalled by the side of the road. Clothing was a fine material, and heavy, uncomfortable, hot, scratchy, and hard to maintain. Creases were where they should have been and kept that way, even if it meant not sitting down. Dress codes were rigorous. I could not buy a black shirt and had to have them made. Beards of any sort were only worn by psychologists, stage magicians, old mariners, and Santa Claus. Adornments like earrings on a man were unknown. No respectable man had tattoos, and if a woman didn't wear a corset or girdle, she was a slut. Men's hair could be worn longer on top if it was white on the sides and back, never long like a girl's. Schools had truant officers and were run more strictly than prisons are now. There was no place for an unregimented child, no matter how brilliant. Today, a person can enjoy heavy metal and still listen to classical music. Yesterday, a kid was an icky or long hair if he preferred classical. Team sports were mandatory if you opted for peer acceptance. I wonder how many gun-toting marginal types got their start, as I did, protecting themselves from average kids. If you were white, Christian, and liked sports, you were safe from criticism and considered all right. It was truly the era of the wasp. All others were ghettoized for their own peace of mind. Sex was marvelously prurient. So much so, in some ways, masturbation was a sin and a sickness, and sex before marriage disqualified anyone from public acceptance. Most marriages served a single purpose: to fuck and get fucked. When one considers the elaborate pageantry accompanying contractual vows, and for a single simple purpose, the guilt imposed by religion becoming glaring. Even more depressing to contemplate are the eugenic effects of entire societies born of such unions. It could be likened to the fates of entire nations determined by the regularity of their bowels. Commerce and personal hygiene products had not yet become the supreme qualifier. But freedom from constipation had. If you were not regular, you existed within a special purgatory along with masturbators and eaters of garlic. Cleanliness was next to godliness, except privately. Generally, people smelled pretty strong. Heavier clothing made them sweat more, and normal activity was strenuous enough to work up a sweat. There are things available now to reduce the danger of offending, but activity is less strenuous and less likely to work up a sweat. Exercise was what one got enough of at work. Women needed no workouts. Housework took care of that. The language was without the sort of profanity expected today. Yet you can insult or offend with impunity. Profanity, like sex, was euphemized by terms which may have conveyed the message, but left much to be desired by the catharsis. What one felt like saying was not what one actually said. Shoot! Understanding was limited to learning, not human relations. Intolerance was rampant because it gave the little man a chance to feel superior. Conformity was so important it made anyone who was slightly different fair game for ridicule or insult. There were no special people. It was a much crueler world for the elderly, the handicapped, and children. Hypocrisy was everywhere because self-righteousness was easily maintained. Though standards in the arts were higher, respect was universal to questionable titles like Reverend. A prominent educator covered a lot of undeserved ground. Any college man was prestigious enough to ensure respect, and armchair generals always had their share of wide-eyed disciples. Wartime exploits were every man's claim to fame. Woe unto the fellow who had no buddy time experiences to relate. You were expected to listen to an ex-serviceman's tales. Now, one can walk away with a clear conscience. The guy on the next bar stool has no captive audience. Con artists and posers always had an audience because everyone was more polite and well-mannered and trusting to a fault. If you locked your door, you were either some kind of paranoid crackpot or else had something to hide. Because there were no collectibles, nothing was worth hiding or locking up. Collectibles were thought of as junk to be thrown out. A car over 5 years old was a jalopy and not to be taken seriously, even though it may have been a custom Packard or Stutz. Older cars wound up being appreciated by high school youth as canvases upon which to paint inane slogans. Books were treated as friends by scholars, but even scholars mistreated their friends miserably, using bacon for bookmarks. Magazines were handled like fish wrapping. Everyone was heavy-handed and heavy-footed. The exceptions were artistic types, considered prissy and effeminate. If you weren't artistic and wanted to be more than a churl, a man in the streets, you had better be prepared to physically defend your sensibilities. Human interaction was more visceral. Personal injury suits didn't yet abound. And one had to be occasionally prove he was not indeed a sissy. A kid could get beaten up for reading Plato or carrying a violin case, unless there was a machine gun inside. Gay meant happy and carefree. If you were homosexual, you were a pansy, queer, fruit, or all-around pervert. Again, with normal sex seeming prurient, hidden homosexuality was even more so, in the hypocrisy. The choir masters, scout masters, sports coaches, camp directors, gym teachers, and priests, all above and beyond reproach. Consequently, much more actual abuse occurred than today, when alternative sexual preferences don't have to be cloaked in, my throat's starting to drop, to be cloaked in sacrosanct credentials or rah-rah overcompensation. The irony is and the honesty and blasphemous openness once exhibited by flagrant homosexuals who were invariably the most intellectually stimulating individuals in every crowd, theirs was not a group identity but a personal one, devoid of evangelism and conversion. They didn't care if the world turned gay or even felt their influence. Now the closet clerks and gymnasium gropers have healthier and gayer competition without true deviance. Food preferences were not catered to in the good old days. Anything other than American had limited availability. Though maligned, fast food often has taste and becomes the easily obtained meal of choice. Pizza could only be eaten in an ethnic neighborhood, with perhaps only a single such specialty place serving an entire city. Likewise with Asian or Mexican food. Despite complaints about the dearth of good music, I think that's death of good music, listeners to the classics never had it so good. It's all there if one wants it. An entire symphony may be purchased for a fraction of its 1940 price and heard non-stop on cassette or CD. The same selection constituted 10 pounds of highly breakable records with a change break every few minutes. An entire collection of favorite films could be owned and viewed by anyone with a VCR. In the past, only the very privileged could afford private projection facilities. The list grows. Once, if you owned or rode a motorcycle, you were stigmatized as a wild nut. If you used the bicycle transportation and were over the age of 14, you were surely an eccentric given to a diet of fruit and berries, garbed in baggy tweeds. If you didn't hunt for sport, you were a milksop sissy. Martial arts were only known as jiu-jitsu and practiced by sneaky yellow bellies. A real man put on the gloves and fought like a real man. If a young man didn't dance, he was a geek who could never expect to get a girl. If a young girl didn't cook and sew, no guy wanted to ever marry her. All kids wanted to play cowboys and Indians, themselves always being the cowboys. The heavy kid was called Fatso, one with glasses, 4 eyes, The ideal bill for a toy, for a boy was something you'd see floating in a toilet bowl, with a face to match. If you were too tall and too thin, you were death warmed over. Girls cursed with aquiline, big noses, large feet, and over 5'4" were considered ugly and avoided. A girl with glasses was destined to be a librarian and a spinster, and presumed to be all dried up. Today's standards for female beauty is exactly what was then considered ungainly and homely. Don't you wish you could go back to those days of yesteryear when the greatest goal was to become president? Then everyone would love and respect you.